Okay, cool.
Welcome, Peter. I hope you are doing well. And welcome to the Naked Dialogue podcast. So I have a bunch of questions that I've just thought about a lot since I've consumed a lot of your work and also, your videos online. So I think I'm going to start with Plato. So from like an idealist perspective, more or less, psychedelics seem to enhance like the metaphysics of mind. So, what would be the Platonian description, perhaps illuminating on the same, since it kind of seems as if the Athenians were also consuming ergot via the potion, by some sort of potion in the Eleusinian mysteries. So what would be the Platonist, like description of the same?
Gosh, well, Bergson, Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, in his last book, Two Sources of Morality and Religion, he has this kind of speculation about Plato, but also the other philosophers, the Athenians especially, who once a year visited, as you say, the Eleusinian mysteries, 13 miles or so from Athens. And it's speculated. Now, it's not absolutely, it's very hard to prove. One reason being that they were called the mysteries because they were mysterious and you were forbidden from talking about them. However, we do know that they had a potion in the Temple of Demeter in the center of the main mysteries. And one had to fast, and the potion was of a specific dosage. And so, yeah, Albert Hofmann, who invented LSD, for example, he speculated that the barley that was a known ingredient of the kykeon, the potion, contained ergot, which is a parasitic fungus, sort of the basis of LSD. But the actual ingredient, there are a lot of different theories as to what it might have been. I mean, ostensibly it was barley, mint, and water, but one theory then is ergot, and there's the reason people believe this is because those mysteries, that mystery religion, which was one of many, but it was the most institutionalized, that went on for 2,000 years. It was closed down by the Christians in the 4th century AD. And people, the sort of reason for going there was to get rid of one's fear of death, mostly it seems. And people spoke of visions there. So some scholars have always thought, well, there was a theatre production therein, and that's what the visions were. But it seems very, very unlikely for a number of reasons when you look into it. I mean, for a start, I don't think theatre would necessarily get rid of your fear of death. One would expect something a bit more sublime. Though theatre can be very powerful, of course, but psychedelics more, I'd say. And so Plato, yeah, he, I mean, there's some evidence. So in the Phaedo, in his book on the soul, he says that he wants to be counted amongst the mystics. And he says that before he starts arguing for his dualist theory, mind or the soul and body are distinct. In the Phaedrus, he sort of speaks of what sounds like a psychedelic trip, being, being in the train of Zeus and seeing visions and so on and so forth, great lights. So there's other indications. One of his dialogues starts on the river where the mysteries are based, the lesser mysteries. So yeah, there's a lot of sort of circumstantial evidence, not absolute, that Plato and also perhaps Pythagoras, that's what Bergson says, who of course influenced Plato, it's believed, they had these kind of mystical experiences. Orphism also played a role, of course, Dionysian festivals that Nietzsche speaks of. And of course the wine, not of course, but it's known that the wine in ancient Greece was psychoactive. You had to water it down a lot. And so, these drugs were not unknown to ancient people. I mean, the Vedas, before these Greeks really spoke about the soma, which is believed to be something akin to ayahuasca. For example, Matthew Clark argues. But anyway, so there's an interesting sort of conjecture that mystical experiences led to some of Plato's philosophy. Like I say, the split between the mind or the soul and the body, that kind of dualism, but also perhaps the other dualism that is that you hinted at, which was the idealism, that there's a dualism between the particular physical world and the ideal forms, transcending space and time. So yeah, to be honest, there's not enough research put into this, so that's why it sort of remains speculative, and perhaps there's just not enough evidence to really to really know the sort of etiology there. But very interesting line of research.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good speculation though, because the mysteries are mysteries for a reason. And then if there's a potion, it's probably for a reason too. Also, like throughout history, there were many philosophers or other intellectuals, intellectual thinkers who experimented with altered states of consciousness. But one thing that comes to my mind was this outside project of 1950s that never happened. So its members being Jung and Einstein. So prior to Outside Project, do you think Jung, Einstein, and all of its members were somehow involved in experimenting with different kind of psychoactive substances?
Well, I mean, so the Outside Project, to listeners who don't know about it, just quickly, was it's a project devised by Humphrey Osmond, who coined psychedelic. He was friends with Aldous Huxley, so him and Huxley mostly, but also other people like John Smithies, a neurophilosopher. They tried to get together the world's leading intellectuals, 50 or 100 or so, to take mescaline, the psychedelic mescaline, and then sort of report back. And in the 1950s, and it didn't happen in the end due to the Ford Foundation pulling out their funding, unfortunately. But yeah, as you say, Jung and Einstein were invited. Whether they would have said yes is another question to that. I mean, for example, Jung is, when you read Jung, he's kind of against psychedelics ostensibly, although it seems, and I'm not an expert in Jung, but in our book, in our new volume, there's a chapter on this. They recently discovered Jung's Red Book. I don't know if you know about this, but that seems to be a good text in which to integrate certain psychedelic experiences, so it can be useful. Ducasse H.H. Price, though, Oxford philosopher, was invited, and he did take mescaline because he wrote an essay on it in the, I think it was in the 40s, maybe 50s, I think the 40s. And who else? Graham Greene and others. But it didn't happen, and it's a pity, because if it did happen, I think the intellectual history of psychedelics would be very different now. So instead, that was sort of suppressed, and then 10 years later, Timothy Leary took hold of it, psilocybin LSD, and sort of annoyed the authorities enough. It's just one of many reasons why there was a kind of crackdown on psychedelics. Timothy Leary, not the only reason by all means, but unfortunately then, because mescaline and ether and hashish even were before then really sort of associated with poets and philosophers to a certain extent. It was niche, it was always niche. And when William James in 1902 wrote about it, he got into trouble even then, part for religious reasons then, because he was talking about mystical experiences being occasioned by drugs, which obviously the church didn't like. But yeah, no, there was an association of philosophers and poets and artists really with psychedelics until the 60s, where the association then became with this subgroup hippies, which is sort of probably over sensationalized by the media, and the criminality and recreation, and so shifted away from this intellectual endeavor to something less important or devalued, unfortunately. So Outside might have stopped that from happening, but alas, no.
Yeah, you're right about Jung's Red Book. There's also this book called Lament of the Dead, which has Sonu Shamdasani and another one of Jung's students, or like someone who was influenced by Jung, and they both go. It's like a dialogue, but they've made it into a book just discussing the Red Book, and it's quite fascinating. I've only read sections of it, I skimmed through it, but it's kind of a good book on Jung. I'm kind of a Jungian.
Yeah, I mean, I unfortunately I'm not. It's one of these thinkers I've always meant to get into, but we've got this Professor Christine Hauskeller and I have edited a book called Philosophy and Psychedelics, and one of the chapters by Juana Sepanen is on Jung's Red Book in relation to psychedelic experience. So I'm sure you'd appreciate that.
Oh yeah, definitely. I'll look into it. Also, you gave like this talk on timelessness with psychedelics, and it was very interesting. So, so you take like a Spinozian perspective on the same, in the sense that you try to decipher timelessness with psychedelics from Spinoza's viewpoint. So, like, can you describe Spinoza's intellectual level of God, and how perhaps it was either similar or different from like the mystics accounts of the same era, if there were any.
Funnily enough, I just got this book in the post today, all the way from India, funnily as it happens, and it's Samuel Alexander, the great philosopher, who's not very, very well known, but it's called Spinoza in Time. So and in there is the intellectual love of God as well. I haven't read it yet though, just got it. Okay, so this is, yeah, it can get, so what shall I say? First of all, timelessness is in theology generally referred to by the word the eternal. So it doesn't mean infinite in duration, no start, no end, but it means stepping outside of time. And some people think that's just an oxymoron, because existence, the necessary condition for existence is duration. However, there is a lineage of thinkers, theologians, and philosophers who talk about Boethius, for example, and even Plato. Of course, the forms are outside of time, Pythagoras, of course, and the Neoplatonists, like Plotinus especially. They speak about this form of existence outside of time. Now, with regard to Spinoza, I interpret Spinoza in my own way, and it seems everyone who reads Spinoza interprets him in a slightly different way, right? Sometimes radically different, So some people deny he's a pantheist, some people say he's an atheist, blah blah blah. Some people even today think he's a materialist, an idealist in the past, It depends how you define those words, of course. But so this is my interpretation. So Spinoza, the reason Einstein liked Spinoza was because Einstein said he was the first modern philosopher to make mind and body one, and that's so he was a monist. There's, in other words, one substance, and that he called nature, but he also called it God, and that's why Joseph Raphson named him a pantheist. That's where the word pantheism comes from. And so that means that when one dies, there's no soul to endure thereafter. There's no sort of enduring life after death. However, and so this philosophy is kind of like the kind of correction of Descartes in many ways. Descartes speaks about, as soul and body as two distinct substances. God, a third substance, of course. But he's not a substance dualist, and they interact. And this interaction is always problematic, still is today, in other words, upward causation, how mind emerges from matter, or downward causation, how the mind has an effect on matter. That sort of started off in a way with Descartes, with physicalism, emergencism, took emphasis and so on. But Spinoza's solution then was to say that there is no upward or downward causation. There's correlation, because they are the same thing. Mind or extension of thought, space and mind were two attributes or two expressions of one thing. So the same thing seen from different perspectives, like the morning star and the evening star, both Venus. And so he sought to prove this in a geometric fashion, like Euclid, in rational, purely logical fashion, without having any faith, no doctrine involved, no dogma. This is what got him in trouble with his own church. He was excommunicated by his fellow Jews in Amsterdam, and his books were banned by the church. So there was this kind of like purely rational, and that's sometimes he's defined as a rationalist, for this reason. However, his main book's called The Ethics, which was published posthumously, and 1677. And in it, it consists of 5 books or 5 parts. In the 5th part, he says, something of the mind does not disappear with the body. Something remains, which is eternal. Right. So this has vexed many scholars since, because it just seems completely contradictory with what he's been saying about mind and body being one thing. So you'd think when the body dies, therefore the mind dies. And in a sense, it does, normal mind. However, what he means by it what he means by the eternality of the mind is not a separate substance existing after one's life in time, in duration, as it were, but rather, and this is again my interpretation, but I think it's not just mine, it's Timothy Spriggs and many others. It's a stepping outside of time, whereby it's so. For example, Frederick Pollock, the great Spinozan scholar of the last century, or the actually 19th century, he wrote that it's not a continuation of existence, it's another manner of existence, it's another form of existing, this eternality. Gilles Deleuze also says that, one can experience timelessness, for Spinoza. And what Spinoza writes about this is, it sort of comes to a peak in the 5th book, at the very end, really, where he talks about 3 kinds of knowledge. First kind is sensible opinion, empirical basic knowledge. Second one is scientific knowledge, generally, or rational knowledge, so logic, science, inference, and so on. But he says there's a 3rd kind of knowledge, which he calls intuition. And this is a form of knowledge where it's not perceptual and it's not conceptual either. It's a form of getting to the essence of substance without abstraction. So for him, thought and extension are forms of abstract, there's kind of forms of us humans understanding substance. There are also, by the way, an infinite number of other expressions, forms of expression. We humans are only privy to 2, thought and extension, mind and matter. But there seems to be a way of understanding reality, substance, which is very difficult and rare, through this 3rd kind of knowledge, or intuition, which culminates in what he calls then the intellectual love of God, amor Dei intellectualis, whereby, because remember, for him, substance is God, and it's also nature, so they're synonyms, whereby when one perceives the essence of this reality, one thereby becomes that reality. So even the subject-object dichotomy then is effaced, and one therefore gets this sense of unity with the fundamental essence of reality, that is God. And so in the intellectual love of God, one becomes God, God becomes oneself. And this, he says, makes one lose the fear of death, a bit like the mysteries we spoke of just now. And it brings tranquility of mind. And it's very difficult to understand it when you read it, and that's why there are all these different interpretations of it. But one can see the sort of legacy of it through former thinkers. So he was well read, Spinoza, but he was brought up before he got excommunicated when he was 23. He read mostly Jewish theology and philosophy, and Maimonides, this great Jewish philosopher, Rambam, he had the similar idea of the infinite intellect. So for him, the universe as God was this mind at large, this cosmic consciousness, as it were, and one's own mind was part of that. And that it was possible to sort of merge one's finite mind into this greater mind. So this, and this, interestingly, Maimonides was very much influenced by Aristotle. And in Aristotle's book, De Anima, Aristotle, just in a small passage, speaks about stepping outside of time as well. Interestingly, this is always confused. There's always been very, very sort of vexed theological legacy, because Aristotle was very influential in Christian thought, Roman Catholicism, and Plato as well, but Aristotle, for the Roman Catholics especially, he was the philosopher, as it were. And this form of stepping outside of time really didn't, as eternality didn't really fit in with the Roman Catholic view, which was dualistic mostly, arguably. So it's been this vexed theological question. You see it through Maimonides, and then, a lot of Jewish scholars think it culminates with Spinoza. Other Spinoza scholars don't think this at all, and they think this is just something that Spinoza wrote to sort of appease his religious censors and so on and so forth. But I don't think this is the case. I think that you can see there's a good reason to accept historical legacy, but also systematically. This intuition, this intellectual love of God, is like what the great poet Romain Rolland calls the flash of Spinoza. So, and Deleuze says this in relation to Rolland. He says Spinoza is a kind of special as a philosopher in the sense that one can understand it rationally, in other words, by the second kind of knowledge, you know. But also a person can have a flash of Spinoza, as Rolland calls it. Got an essay on that, whereby one sort of intuits the whole thing. Of course, when one describes it later, if one has such an intuition, then you know one can't put it into words, you know, so generally speaking, and that's where philosophy helps, I suppose. So anyway, so that's my sort of interpretation of Spinoza, and I'm just interested. I mean, a lot of so-called a lot of psychedelic states report these, you know, famously these unitive experiences, these timeless experiences. So I wanted to compare this kind of ontology of Spinoza, this timelessness we arguably find in Spinoza, with phenomenology of certain mystical states induced by psychedelics. And so in this book I mentioned from Bloomsbury, I've got a chapter there on this very topic, where I sort of, just compare this ontology with this phenomenology, just to create a kind of symbiosis, so that sort of philosophy might be able to explain the phenomenology, and in turn the phenomenology sort of substantiates the ontology. Anyway, that's my current thinking. But having said that, I don't think Spinoza's kind of, you know, got all the right answers. There's certain limitations with him, and I think Alfred North Whitehead kind of improves upon Spinoza's philosophy to a certain extent. For example, he brings in, you know, brings in evolution and so on. Not that Spinoza was sort of contrary to the theory of evolution, but of course it wasn't a thought of concept at the time, really. But I think generally, when, you know, in psychedelic circles today, you know, one can have so-called mystical experiences. These are problematic as well, because in the Americas, in indigenous cultures in Americas, they don't speak of this. So you think, how much does Western culture or Eastern culture, interestingly, kind of condition experiences? Is another question in the philosophy of psychedelics, whether psychedelics condition, or rather whether culture conditions not just the interpretation, but the experience itself, or in contradistinction, whether psychedelic drugs can decondition one out of one's culture. This is the debate between perennialism and contextualism. I take a third route there. So the question of unity and so on is still, like, it's problematic in many ways, but nonetheless, I mean, certain psychedelics, especially 5-MeO-DMT, seem to induce such a sort of non-perceptual, mostly non-perceptual unitive experience. So I especially took the phenomenology of this drug, or the phenomenology occasioned by this drug, and then compared it to Spinoza, which no one's done.
Which is brilliant. Also, I mean, like you were talking about intuition before, even Sartre in his imaginary, you know, was very much focused on perception and intuition. And it was like, for me, it was a very good influential book into, you know, the phenomenology of perception in a nutshell. Also, it just came into my mind, the other Jungian thinker who wrote The Lament of the Dead was James Hillman, with so much industry. Okay, I had another thought which I probably lost.
James Hillman, well, I'll say with Hillman, I mean, I've only read his book on the nightmare, Pan and the Nightmare, is it? I can't remember exact name. I remember I really enjoyed that, but that's all I could comment on anyway. So.
No, but timelessness is a very interesting, just like thing to like a subject to think about. Then there's also the triplicity of time, which is past, present, future. So, you know, how would you basically distinguish the Kantian noumenon, which is time being a projection of subjectivity, with the conception of physics, where, you know, the objective order of events or relativity thinks that the present is probably, like, they don't basically consider the present in the order of events that much.
I mean, this is a very, very, like, you know, deep question, really. And I'll say, I mean, oh God, where to start? I suppose, you know, Einstein wrote this letter to a friend of his, who's mourning her husband, I believe. And he said, you know, we in physics, we don't believe in time, the existence of time, really. So when Minkowski, you know, Einstein's teacher, spoke about time as the fourth dimension, he formulated it. It was spoken by before, but as such, but it sort of puts time on a dimension then which is static and thus not real. And this is Bergson's, had big problems with this. Obviously, he said, well, this is the wrong way to think about time, because time in its essence is duration. However, and also like dividing time into T1, T2, T3, as Bergson sort of emphasizes, obviously pure abstraction. It sort of divides duration into discrete units, a bit like atomism, which is problematic for a number of reasons as well. Because I think relations are more primary than things that are related. But with regard to time, okay, so I suppose one useful way of perhaps looking at it is that one is to understand that condition our experience of time or duration. So there's a great paper on this a famous paper by J.M.E. McTaggart called The Unreality of Time from the early 20th century, which is people still trying to sort of figure out properly. And actually, I've got a reading session on it in a few weeks. McTaggart was part of the British Idealists, who were mostly influenced by Hegel. But of course, Hegel was influenced by Kant, so we go back to the noumena there. I think, so with regard to the present, past and the future, it seems that this distinction, this tripartite distinction, is conditioned by the existence of a subject in the present. In other words, a consciousness. Because without that consciousness determining what has passed and what's future, that it cannot be spoken of. There's no objective present, as it were. This is what, very basic. This is one sense in which time is conditioned by subjectivity. Another interesting thing there, of course, is the ontological status of the past as opposed to the future. That people generally, vaguely believe that the past somehow is more real than the future because it sort of happened, but it doesn't exist now. And the future doesn't exist now either, but it's somehow less real. And so it becomes more parsimonious when one considers that the past and future and the present are all have the same ontological sort of status in this respect. This is Spinoza again then, so he's a sort of fatalist. Another subjective condition of time is a specious present, the length of the present moment. So again, this can't be objectively verified in any way. You can't do an experiment to say what is, one can talk about possible minimum durations of time, perhaps with this and that. But of course, that's not the same as the experienced present anyway. The experienced present seems to vary, so especially, again, interesting with psychedelics, you can have a really long present moment where your hand becomes like one solid object, or the sort of trail of it becomes one object. And of course, once more, you need a sort of consciousness to determine that. Husserl, of course, speaks about this as well. And yeah, so those are two of a number of ways in which consciousness determines the character of time. Another way, of course, is what Bergson calls the rhythm of duration, which is the speed of time, the speed at which we experience change. My brother, for example, has had an experience where he almost killed a child on a bicycle, and he was riding the bicycle. I had to brake really quickly, and his body flew over the child. Luckily, it didn't touch him. But in that moment, everything seemed to be in slow motion. And it's not as if it would be impossible to say that he was he was with this falsely experiencing the passage of time, because there cannot exist a standard to which one compares it. In other words, an objective standard. So again, we see the sort of, again, the subjective nature of our understanding of time. Therefore, one could infer then that, well, if the nature of time, the species present, the rhythm of duration, the tripart distinction between past, present, and future is determinable by the subject, the conscious subject, or the subconscious subject, but it needs to be a subject. somehow, or some form of experience at least, then if we take the subject away, if that's even, theoretically, if we take the subject away, what remains, in terms of time? And then you realize the species present doesn't really exist then, the past, present, future doesn't exist as such, and the speed of time doesn't exist. Of course, at the speed of light, apparently time stops completely. So why not take that as a sort of proper tenet of the objectivity of time? And if you have that, then that's Einstein returning to his great philosopher Spinoza, eternality of time. Reality in its pure sense has this timeless essence. And again, arguably this is Kant's noumena as well. Yeah, time, as you say, it's just a projection of our minds in the real world, as it were, the thing in itself. This is not there. If one accepts that, then it makes experiences such as timelessness a little bit more ontologically persuasive, as opposed to being a hallucination of some variety. So these metaphysical and physical or physicist questions sort of really can inform how we understand psychedelic experiences and mystical and other sort of forms of experience as well.
It's quite interesting, the irreality of the past and the oblivious future, and like what one has to believe in. Also, I think it was James' account of species present, if I'm not mistaken, and then Bergson's rhythm of duration. So you already commented on that, so that's also very interesting. So now to kind of take a turn to like another realm entirely, like I guess via some sort of sophisticated, also like manipulative nature of the political world, drugs like alcohol and tobacco are legal considerably, and they're considerably very, very fatal, as opposed to all of the drugs which are in Schedule 1. So there's often debates, whether we should ban them, whether there should be, whether all drugs should be legal. But I often think it's a very good question, in the sense that we don't know exactly how things are going to turn out if all drugs were legal all around the world. Because either it could be catastrophic, in the sense that if you compare it to the epidemics in the US with opioids, or we can see the Portugal model where they've legalized everything and the rates have gone down. So both of them are two things that can happen. Like, which one would you opt for? Like, what do you think would happen if this case was like were to fruition at all?
I generally take an anti-prohibitionist stance. However, as you say, there are dangers in just pure unregulated legalization. I mean, you wouldn't want children taking LSD, really, or people driving taking acid or whatever, right? So, like with alcohol, I think there would need to be regulation for a start. Another danger of legalizing certain drugs is the kind of rare nature of certain plants and animals that produce them. So, like for example, the Sonoran desert toad and certain cacti, if suddenly legalized, you'd have mass, that could endanger their existence. So there's a lot of things to take into account here. Portugal, though, as you say, seems to be quite successful. But then you can compare this to the opium wars between Britain and China, where the Chinese people, many of the Chinese people were sort of addicted to opium. The Chinese government wanted to stop it. The British government sort of imposed their will upon them. And so, yeah, you can see, and yeah, the opioid crisis in the US, as you say, with fentanyl. So, I mean, really it comes down to this notion of liberalism, how much power do you want to give the state? I mean, do people have the right to endanger their lives? I mean, they do when they drive or do dangerous sports and so on. Do you want government regulation against this? I mean, the argument from Mill and so on, as long as you don't harm others, so you can make the case for drugs that you wouldn't harm others, or at least less so than driving. But these kind of questions are, in my mind, undeterminable, again, because there exists no objective standard by which you can really say this is the right political way and this is the wrong one. Of course, there are other practical considerations. For example, if you have to pay your own healthcare, if you endanger yourself, for example, that changes certain extent, as opposed to if you don't, like here in Britain, generally. But ultimately, I don't think there's any way to determine a correct or incorrect answer. So you have to go with personal preference. And my personal preference is that we should be, I'm in favor of cognitive liberty, that we should be able to explore our minds without state interference. I generally don't like state interference, really. But also another thing one could argue, when we talk about one could pursue an immanent critique, as critical theorists say. So, the drug laws as they stand are completely illogical and unscientific. They're based on, well, a long history of use of alcohol, for example, here, as well as people's general perceptions. So, if you suddenly legalized LSD, you'd get fewer votes, or the Conservative government might, for example. So this doesn't happen for that reason. So therefore, if you want to change things, you have to change the voters' general consciousness of these things. And how do you do that? Well, yeah, I suppose you could start talking about, the illogic, the sort of illogic behind it and the unscientific nature of it. But that doesn't really sway people either. There's another element here of prohibition, of course, which is religious, which is really hard to overcome. I mean, we have, when the Roman Catholics, the Iberians went to the Americas, they saw the psychedelic use there. They considered it, they defined it as satanic. This is something that the Roman Catholic, I wouldn't call it Western, I'd call it Christian, because Christians also went up into the north of Europe and sort of considered their pagan ways satanic as well, and destroyed them and colonized them, right? So it's just continuation of this dominant Christian movement, but they saw their sort of the psychedelic use as satanic. They became possessed by devils and so on and so forth. Anything spiritual that was not Christian obviously is not, is generally deemed to be satanic. And then of course you had the Puritans coming to the USA as well. They partly did prohibit alcohol even in the early 20th century. Didn't work out. But there's also that, like, for example, like I mentioned, William James in 1902, when he spoke about when he had this book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, and in a later chapter there, and he talks about how alcohol is the first step onto the mystical state, and then nitrous oxide and so on. This was people were aghast at this, thinking, how can you possibly say that drugs can induce these mystical states that these great mystics through the canon have spoke about before? So there's this religious sort of antagonism towards a spiritual life induced by psychedelics. Also, of course, because generally mystical states and stuff, it's believed that you should have to work towards them for many years, and so on. This is R.C. Zainer's criticism against Aldous Huxley, for example. So there's a number of, and then another element of prohibition was racism, simply, like the war on drugs inaugurated by Nixon. It's known that this was partly based on getting rid of the stopping the hippies from voting against him through LSD, and the blacks against him through crack cocaine. And this is sort of documented now, I believe. And then marijuana against the Mexican immigrants and so on, right? So there's a lot of, there's a number of reasons for prohibition. So one can at least expose those reasons, and then that might make people think twice about being against, decriminalization or legalization of drugs. But this will take decades. I mean, a lot of people are just set in their thoughts, which are based on propaganda from the last 50 years. It's very hard to get rid of this, no matter the science or reason. Another way of getting rid of this kind of these kind of dogmas is by pushing the fact that psychedelics especially can be therapeutic. So most of the psychedelic research now is on the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. And when you say that to people, it's very hard for people to be against therapy, against helping people PTSD or depression, whatever it may be. So this is the pursuit. The danger of that, of course, is that only, psychedelics are only allowed to be used in clinical settings, which then just still allows people to go to prison for, ridiculous reasons. So it's, yeah, it's a very, very complicated situation at the moment, but it's changing.
Yeah, the history of prohibition is honestly crazy, because like the CIA was experimenting with LSD and whatnot, and then then I think came the hippie culture after like a good amount of duration, and then Nixon was like war on drugs. So and until now it's like Schedule 1 has marijuana and like all of these drugs, which is like crazy because they have such therapeutic value, but alcohol and tobacco is so okay to consume and like everything.
Yeah, but I
I
wouldn't want to ban alcohol either. I mean, I just don't like this whole idea of prohibiting anything really. I mean, even fentanyl. But and you know, who gives the state the right to prohibit anything? You know, I mean, what's that right based on? It's, again, impossible. But there's just historical reasons that you can sort of tease out.
Yeah, it's quite true. Yeah, the whole prohibition thing is a current argument at the moment, and like there's so many people saying that, you know, like all drugs should be legal, but then there are people who are like only a certain section should be legal. But you're correct, like all drugs should be legal, and it kind of also comes into the free will argument more or less, which is like controversial. You know, you comment on it, like next thing you know, it's like another thing entirely.
Yeah, one has to be careful. I mean, I'd say, you know, legal, but with regulation, of course, just like alcohol is regulated. So again, I wouldn't want, you know, people driving whilst they're taking a high dose of LSD. That wouldn't be a good idea. But nonetheless, I think, you know, like there was this Lancet study from David Nutt and his fellows, and it showed that, yeah, alcohol was the most dangerous, magic mushrooms were the least dangerous. And so that these are still in Britain class A, you know, Schedule 1 or whatever you call it, is just absurd, really. But I think things are changing. Our Prime Minister, even in the House of Parliament, said he might reconsider rescheduling psilocybin, magic mushroom main chemical, for a clinical use soon, thanks to the work of Crispin Blunt and other people working for him. So we'll see. I mean, like I say, these things are changing. Also, there's so much another whole angle here, you know, which I haven't even mentioned, is a huge investment being put into psychedelic drugs now. I mean, there are more conferences on investing in psychedelics than in psychedelic experience. And of course, it's in their interest to at least allow for clinical deregulation in terms of profit. But then you have to be careful that they're not sort of pushing their, you know, the views too much. And of course, there's issues of biopiracy here, you know, appropriating other cultures' uses and knowledges and so on and so forth. So it's an ethical minefield, really. I mean, this whole psychedelic renaissance has made emerge new ethical questions, which is another reason why philosophy, you know, as a sort of harbor of ethics, needs to sort of get involved now, as it's doing, as we're beginning to do at Exeter University, for example.
Yeah, very true. Also, you're very much like, I think you comment a lot about Humphrey Davey, so and I think he was an idealist philosopher, perhaps also influenced by Spinoza. And you know, he also commented this hilarious thing that when he was under the influence of nitrous oxide, he actually deciphered Hegel, which is like hilarious to me. So what do you think about like the intellectual predicament of psychoactive drugs in Britain during that time when Davey was alive?
Well, so Humphrey Davey, he called himself a chemical philosopher. Today he's known as a chemist. He discovered a number of elements, and he famously invented the miner's safety lamp. And there's a statue of him 7 miles from here in his hometown of Penzance, where he's carrying this lamp. But yeah, he was, so he in 1799, he took 200 pints of nitrous oxide. And by the way, nitrous oxide wasn't basically included as a psychedelic in Humphrey Osmond's paper, when he defined psychedelic in 1957. So I do consider it a psychedelic. Some people say it's not, but it obviously is. So yeah, he experimented with that, and he said all that came out of it, and he said all that exists is thoughts. And he was there referring to the German idealists, Kant especially. So he was, why? Because he was friends with a number of the known romantic poets, so like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Southey, and others, Thomas de Quincey, loosely. And they were reading German philosophy, idealism of the time, and which was kind of new then, just coming to Britain. Also Spinozism. So in the 1799, the nitrous oxide said this, but in 1780s, 15 years before or so, there was a so-called pantheism controversy in Germany and the continent, where suddenly people, said Spinozism, we should reconsider Spinozism. Lessing was reading it and so on, but this was, like I say, Spinozism was because it's really controversial, because he was known as an atheist or a pantheist and so on. But this thought, then, this kind of intellectual uprising happening in Germany, Spinozism was the secret religion of Germany for apparently in the early 1800s. This was happening on the continent. It spread over to Britain amongst the Romantics, the Romantic poets. And Humphrey Davey was one of those, really. He was also a published poet. He wrote, like I say, the poet, the Spinozist. And it took 70 years, interestingly, for its idealism from the continent to reach academic philosophy in England. So then you had sort of in the late 1800s, 1870s onwards, you had like the great British idealists, the most famous of which was probably F.H. Bradley, but also then later on MacTaggart, Green, people like this. But yeah, they were like 70 years before. They were interested in this and experimenting with 70 years before, but also interestingly experimenting with it in terms of altering their consciousness. This is something that academic philosophers, to my knowledge, didn't do. Humphrey Davey, yeah, he was at the forefront of that. He, I mean, at the time, sort of early 1800s, until the 1830s, really, a philosopher and scientist were not separate things. There were some natural philosophers who sort of then evolved into scientists. But Davey considered himself a philosopher, a chemist, but as a result, the interest, it was then prevalent in his mind, the link between the philosophy of the time, the idealism that was popular, and the chemistry of the time, and his phenomenology as well. So this is something interestingly he all sort of mixed together. He's got a great book, his last book, called The Last Days of a Philosopher, 1829, 1830. He's got the chapter 1's this most amazing, it sounds like a psychedelic trip. He goes through the history of the world, and then he sort of goes into space and sees it describes all these amazing alien civilizations, Sounds, very modern. It's sort of like a science fiction film, but it's written in 1829, and undoubtedly based on not only his nitrous oxide experiments. He also took a nitrous oxide all the time and as a habit, but also the opium that they were all taking at the time as well, Coleridge especially. So yeah, really fascinating period. I've got my new book, other new book, Modes of Sentience, coming out in a few weeks. I've got a whole chapter on Humphrey Davey. I've called it the First Scientific Psychonaut, where it sort of details that, and then it goes through that report and links it to the Spinozist poem and to Spinoza's philosophy a little bit, and to idealism. So it's just, it's a lost part of a philosophic heritage, really, in Britain.
No, Davey's definitely very, very interesting. Like after one of your lectures, when I encountered him, I definitely went on and researched about him because it seems very interesting. The entire nitrous oxide thing was definitely very, very intriguing. Also, there's been, oh no, please go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say a TV crew's coming down to film all about this section in a few weeks from Arte TV, and it's German film crew. So they're going to film the statue, and then I'm going to talk about it in Morab Library. It's an amazing little library in Penzance. And so we'll bring that we'll return it back to Germany.
No, that's very interesting. Okay, so there's been like several accounts of philosophers, or you can call intellectual thinkers, like Walter Benjamin with On Hashish, and like Thomas De Quincey with Confessions of an Opium Eater, where he goes like the pleasures of opium, the pains of opium. It's an interesting short book. I actually encountered that book in like one of the Amsterdam English bookstores, and it was like that book is interesting. I go, what, like De Quincey was on this? I had no idea.
Yeah, a very excellent book, Confessions of an English Opium Eater. Yeah, I mean, he's just talks about his opium addiction, doesn't it? And but the visions from that opium, again, can be in high doses very psychedelic.
Yeah, and also very dreamlike too. Like I think he comments on the dreams. And like
And one really interesting aspect of it was he talks about mnemonic recollections, which were perfect. So like a recollection of it, I can't remember exactly now, like his 5th birthday or something like this, but in exquisite detail. That's really interesting from a philosophical Bergsonian point of view, because it's sort of, unless it's a false memory, which is possible, I suppose. It didn't seem to be though, but if it was a real memory, then it's sort of, again, indicative of the fact that memories in the past don't fully disappear, it's just the access to them disappear. It's an interesting question in philosophy of mind and also in neuroscience, and there's, also in terms of psychedelic philosophy, that, I mean, a lot of therapy in psychedelics occurs through recalling traumatic experiences of the past that normally have been suppressed. Psychedelics seem to allow for this. This is one of the mechanisms of therapeutic use of psychedelics. One danger of that, though, is, like I say, false memories. I just heard this horrific incident of, I won't go into too much detail, but it was a man in his, an older aged man who had, through psychedelics, had this experience of his parents trying to kill him when he was a child. And came out of it, and of course he's traumatized by this, and his parents are dead, so there's just no way of ever finding out whether this was a true or a false memory. And this is obviously, I mean, you can go through certain therapy now, but that is something that is not probably beneficial to have in one, to recall or to imagine. So there are dangers to this kind of recall as well. There are many dangers to psychedelics that at the moment are being sort of overlooked because of the investment put into them now. But I mean, one thing I'd like to write about soon is the dark sublime in relation to the psychedelics. I've had very dark, by which I mean sort of gothic, morbid experiences. Now, personally, I've been really fascinated by them. So they're not negative as such, but they were hugely dark and demonic, with skulls and demons and just pure hell, really. And hopefully not literally, but so because I wasn't brought up in a particularly religious setting, I didn't really attribute them any reality, but to someone who was, that could be very, very traumatizing. Not physically, I mean, they're not physically dangerous, these drugs, but psychologically they can be. So, one has to look at both sides. And with a drug like 5-MeO-DMT, I mean, it's so powerful that, it's just really not for everyone at all. I mean, you have to be, it's, one takes it and one doesn't dare to take it again for a while at least, because it's so overwhelming psychologically. A lot of these things need to be integrated. And I think, again, though, interestingly, we were, David Arizzo and Meg Spriggs were at Exeter last week speaking about their work at Imperial College on psychedelics. And for example, they've got this new project trying to decipher the neural correlates of 5-MeO-DMT experience. They spoke about, after these events, they try to integrate them to sort of make them therapeutic. But I think it's very, I mean, I did ask the question, how can one sort of integrate a completely alien experience? I mean, when I say alien, I don't mean necessarily of aliens, but of course I can include that. But that's something that is kind of completely changes your state of being, I mean, like in terms of having even to say experience is too much, but sort of, like timelessness or something like this, or this sense of extreme profundity, or where percepts and concepts get fused and replaced and so on, things that one can't really speak of. How could one integrate that into one's general framework of life? It seems that this is very difficult. Of course, one can just simply talk about it. That won't necessarily get one any answers. That's where I see sort of metaphysics becoming quite important, perhaps even in a psychological sense, to integrate that into, like, for example, integrate timelessness into Spinozism or Kantianism for that matter, or at least, well, I don't think one will ever attain any certainty, but at least it sort of gives one a little bit more reason to or a little bit more anchorage in terms of understanding these things.
Yeah, you're completely right about the dangers, so the dark side of psychedelics, and they're definitely overlooked at the moment, and definitely because of capitalistic, insights. Like, yeah, we can make mushroom this, mushroom that, and of course, if they want to, achieve this kind of capitalistic essence of just like making these products and everything, they're going to want to definitely not get into the dark side of psychedelics. But it is very important to look into the dark side. As you said, you can have like experiences that you don't definitely want to have, like the demonic ones, or like having a very bad trip and then you're like, oh my god, like what reality is. So yeah, definitely the dark side of psychedelics is something everyone should be looking into. It's something that I personally do, like, you need to research your best whenever you're taking any kind of psychoactive substance, be it anything. Research is like very, very important. So yeah, that is like a mandatory thing. Also, you talk a good amount about how Nietzsche was influenced by Schopenhauer, and regarding the conception of will. So for Schopenhauer, will is like the fundamental essence of all things, whereas for Nietzsche, will is more like an internal effect formed towards power, if I'm getting that right. So like, can you comment like briefly on like what was Schopenhauer's, why was Nietzsche basically so inspired by Schopenhauer?
Gosh, well, I mean, in terms of his life, he found a book, The World as Will and Representation by Schopenhauer. Nietzsche did when he was in his early 20s, I believe. He was brought up as a Lutheran. His father was a pastor, although he died when he was 5, and a very Christian family. And of course, Schopenhauer was an atheist, and this sort of, was a means of escaping, I think, this past, when he was studying philology. And so that, and then through that love of Schopenhauer, he became friends with Richard Wagner, the great composer, and his wife Cosima, and a number of others. And this influenced, this was his general outlook. He wrote a book called Schopenhauer as Educator. And his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, was sort of based on Schopenhauerian ontology and ethics, really. But I mean, moving further away from Christianity still, Nietzsche thought he fathomed the Christian influence in Schopenhauer as well. And this is what really shifted it. Also fell out with Wagner, well, for this reason, really. But Nietzsche famously thought that certain so-called values such as compassion, humility, the helping hand, and so on, these were really Christian virtues, or Christian virtues rather were the epitome of slave morality, which you see in other cultures as well. Christianity was the epitome of it, and he opposed this to master morality epitomized by the Romans, that actually wasn't really compassion and humility that were the greatest values, but rather, strength, pride. Aristotle's crown of virtues was pride, for example, and so on, courage. And then he saw Schopenhauer. Now, Schopenhauer's ethics is a tricky one, because it was Schopenhauer, he actually coined the term slave morals. So there's one way which Nietzsche influenced him, and by which he means, and this is also Schopenhauer's critique of Kant, even though he followed Kant's idealism generally, but his ethics he completely rejected. Schopenhauer completely rejected Kant's ethics, because he says that Kant just, no, Schopenhauer said that Kant simply assumes that ethics must be normative, must be imperative. And like one ought to do this, one has a duty not to do that, or whatever, right? Prescriptive, in other words. Morality, Kant assumed morality must be prescriptive, and as a result of that, Kant said, therefore, we have to simply assume we can't prove the existence of God, the soul, and freedom. And he says, no, you don't have to assume that, because you don't have to assume morality is prescriptive. Rather, Schopenhauer says morality is only descriptive. People can't help the way, I mean, Schopenhauer didn't believe in free will, so not on the general sense. So he said people can't help what they do, like Spinoza, who's influenced by Spinoza. When you realize that, it brings peace of mind. People are determined by their, well, today we would say genetics, epigenetics, where we've been brought up, and so on and so forth. And another reason for this is that he saw, from a Kantian sense, then time to be, or duration to be not real. So ultimately, the future, the past, and present must all exist at once, which means one's not free to change that. But nonetheless, he says he still values compassion, because compassion is the intuition of the unity of all things. And that's how he valued things descriptively. Like you can descriptively prefer rabbits to rats. It's not the rats' fault that they are rats, and they have the character of rats, but you don't blame them, but still you prefer rabbits because they're fluffier and kind of whatever, right? So Schopenhauer had the same approach to people in a way, like he preferred certain virtues of compassion in people, even though people couldn't help if they were selfish or not. But Nietzsche saw this as Christian morality still seeping in. Even though Schopenhauer said, morality, the normative form of morality that Kant assumes is from the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, thou shalt do this and that, essentially in the West, at least, this is our heritage here. And but Nietzsche said, even this notion that even having a descriptive morality whereby compassion is valued above all else, that's still to take compassion as a main virtue. And this is really just symptomatic of the victory of Christianity over other ways of thinking in the West, the pagan ways of thinking. And so he takes it one step further, and linked to that, so Schopenhauer's notion of the will is multifarious. Brian McGee's got this great book, The Philosophy of Schopenhauer, where he distinguishes, I believe, these different ideas of the will in Schopenhauer. On the basic level, there's the will to live, which is very much like the Conatus and Spinoza. You see it in the history of philosophy, really, Aquinas and so on. And then there's the will as the noumena, almost, there's one thing that you can actually, there's one aspect of noumena, as it were. He doesn't use that term. There's one thing in itself, Schopenhauer says, that one does have access to, and that's the will. And so one's own will is kind of part of this greater will. And this will then is distinct. Nietzsche never had anything like this, but on the basic level of will to live, he replaced that with will to power. So it's not the basic pathos, Nietzsche calls it, like feeling, sentience, subconscious, whatever it may be, is a feeling not to survive, not merely to survive, but to develop. This is what he means by Macht, power. It doesn't mean like, necessarily greed over others and sort of Napoleon complex. It just means striving to improve. So, and the will to survive, he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, section 13, I believe, it's just, the will to survive is just the lowest form of the will to power. So to improve one's life, as it were, one has to survive at the lowest level. That's one condition. So there is a striving, of course, to self-defend and so on. But that doesn't, when you've reached survival point, it doesn't end there. It continues. Spinoza really also writes this, if you read him carefully. His Conatus is, although he says, it's the sort of, it's the will to persist, to persevere in oneself. Really, in the short treatise, I think he talks about it being an expansive thing, really, is that one survives and then improves oneself. By, for example, passing exams or getting a license or whatever it may be, there's this need to develop. That need to develop is not just greed, and it's not, and therefore that element of the will to power in Nietzsche is kind of goes against the sort of humility aspect of Christian valuation. that one should be content with survival. This world is not important anyway because there's another world in heaven or hell or whatever. Well, heaven. So Nietzsche sort of repudiates that, puts value in this world, like back to where Spinoza put it, and then says that our fundamental drive is like self-enhancement. And that, by the way, that doesn't necessarily mean of one's own self. It could be the self-enhancement of one's group. And ultimately, if one's extremely powerful, Nietzsche writes, it could be the self-enhancement of the humanity as a whole. So, so then in a sense, that does come back to compassion, but compassion's not the basis of it. It's complex. And of course, just as like there are many interpretations of Spinoza, so there's probably even more of Nietzsche.
No, it's definitely complex, but then the prescriptive versus descriptive kind of does some sort of justice to explaining, what were the differences.
Yeah,
so
this is a really important distinction in ethics, descriptive and prescriptive ethics. Just understanding that has a big effect on how one sees the world, I believe.
Yeah. Also, you also talk about Nietzsche's use of drugs, which I don't think many people talk about, at least from what I've research and gather, and how his use of opium was probably the main drug he was consuming was probably opium, and also I think you said potassium bromide and chloral hydrate.
Chloral hydrate was actually the one he, at one point at least, used the most of, against headaches mostly. But in big enough doses, these can cause hallucinations. And there's a case where he hallucinated flowers around him, or so his good friend reported. But like Nietzsche, so his father died when he was a young boy, and he died of softening of the brain. People think that Nietzsche caught syphilis from prostitute and died of this, but that's not definite. He might have had some kind of some other ailment that was inherited, from his father, perhaps, brain cancer even, perhaps. When he was at Schopfurter, when he was a child, he had to take 6 months off for extreme headaches. And this was related to his bad vision, which he suffered all his life. and this just got worse and worse. And he had to leave Basel, University in Basel, because of these migraines and short-sightedness and so on, myopia. And so he took drugs to sort of cure this. He was also a medic in the war, Franco-Prussian War, where he sort of administered morphine. And he took all kinds of drugs. And it's even joked that he went to the pharmacy and could get any concoction of drugs he wanted because he was a doctor. They never thought to ask what kind of doctor he was. He was not a medical doctor, obviously, but he got anything he wanted. So we don't even know what he took. Really, but what is known are fuel, as you say, potassium bromide, chloral hydrate, opium. Of course, everyone took opium as painkiller at the time, and perhaps even a Javanese narcotic that might have contained cocaine. But again, somewhat speculative. This is his sister and mother say he took this, and he became addicted, and this is one reasons why he went mad, even in 10 years before he died. It's all a bit speculative, but it's for sure that he took a lot of drugs. Another interesting aspect of that, as I brought out in my first book, Noumenautics, was that his first book was dedicated to the god of intoxication, Dionysus, taking us back to ancient Greece again. And his later books also spoke about the Dionysian worldview, the Dionysian as opposed to Christian worldview. And in fact, the last sentence of his autobiography, I think, reads, "Have I been understood? Dionysus against crucified." So this element of intoxicated consciousness was always, at least started off and ended his philosophy, and that was carried through with the actual use of a lot of psychoactive drugs. I wouldn't say psychedelic drugs, but psychedelic inducing visions, at least through his drugs. So I tried to make a case for why his madness was partly at least occasioned by these drugs and how it might fit into his philosophy with regard to Dionysus. Again, mostly speculative, but there is.
Yeah, even I think a lot about what was up with Nietzsche, because when you read him, it's like, what's going on? And I think he says, "I'm Dionysus," somewhere, I think.
Yeah. He signs off his letters, doesn't he, to Strindberg, the Swedish writer.
Yeah.
nice. Just what, that was 18. Yeah, well, 1890 or so. I can't remember now.
Yeah, and also I think, him being a doctor of philology, I think he was a doctor of philology, like definitely he could have gotten any drugs and experimented with them. But then, like few weeks ago, I was on PubMed and I encountered like one of these researches or like someone's research paper. And they were saying, what kind of psychiatric disorder he might have had. And there's like a lot of speculations like bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, something like that. But I think people don't consider drugs enough when it comes to like analyzing what was happening with Nietzsche's brain. I think they consider more on what was up with his brain, what was his father's, hereditary stuff.
I mean, I think one reason for that as well is, well, not only because people don't like to think of Nietzsche as a drug user in the 20th century because of the criminal connotations of drugs, but another aspect is that it was, as I say, his sister and mother who pushed this drug narrative. I mean, he lived, his sister looked after him, his mother as well, until she died, until he died, for over 10 years and knew him better than anyone else. And they pushed this narrative that it was drugs, that basically this addiction to drugs and the concoction thereof that brought him to insanity and essentially killed him. But as you might know, his sister's not well appreciated because she was a proto-Nazi, basically. And, she married a guy who was a huge anti-Semite who founded this blonde colony in South America. And she became friends with Hitler even, his sister, Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche. And Hitler even came to her funeral, I believe. So any narrative that she pushed, obviously, as people don't want to accept. I mean, people take this too far with her because, there's this book, The Will to Power, it's a posthumous collection of Nietzsche's notes. I mean, I hear it all the time that this wasn't written by Nietzsche, this was written by his sister, therefore it shouldn't be written. Completely false. Everything in that book was written by Nietzsche. It's simply that she edited it, the book, she put it together, she chose which sections were to be placed in this posthumous collection. But not only her, there were other people involved as well, scholars. And when you read it, you see parallels between what he's writing in that notebook and in his book. And also another aspect of this is she wasn't particularly bright. There's no way she could have written passages in that book. There was a guy who worked for her in Weimar. What's his name now? He founded these alternative schools. I forgot his name. That doesn't come to me. But he said, he had to teach her what her own brother was trying to say in his books. So the idea that she could have written these passages is absurd. What are these schools called? Right. He wrote an essay on Nietzsche as well. Will come to me in a minute. Anyway, yeah. So that's another reason, anyway, why people sort of overlook his drug use because of the association with his sister.
Yeah, and it's also hilarious.
Rudolf Steiner. That's who I'm thinking of. Yeah, so he worked for his sister, you see, and tried to teach her, but he said it's hopeless. I gave up. She doesn't understand anything. So.
Yeah, Rudolf Steiner is powerful, and also Madame Blavatsky. It's like I encountered his lectures on Spotify the other day. Like they have uploaded a bunch of them, and like I'm just like, what's happening? Like it's quite potent. But also like about his sister, it's kind of crazy that she would push that drugs thing on Nietzsche when Nazi Germany was actively giving their soldiers amphetamines. And also, like experimenting more or less with LSD, maybe, like there's definitely historical accounts there that the amphetamines were given to the soldiers in World War II. This was yeah. So it's hilarious that the sister would push this drug thing on.
I think one reason for it though was that she wanted to move away from this narrative that he went mad because of syphilis caught from a prostitute. Didn't seem noble enough for a great philosopher to go that way. So she thought, well, so it's been argued. It has been argued that that's where she pushed the drugs angle. But I don't think that really makes sense because that's not a great or noble way to go through drug addiction, is it? Plus, we've got a lot of evidence of the drugs he used. I mean, the letters and so on, and even poems. and whatnot. So yeah, it's an interesting history of scholarship, really.
Yeah, it's interesting. Whenever I get into Nietzsche, it's like another realm entirely. So kind of like to conclude, because oh damn, sorry, that my phone fell. Apologies. So to conclude, what would be your comments, thoughts, ideas around the phenomenology of psychedelics, and how it can also aid some insight into panpsychism?
Well, I mean, generally speaking, I think there's all this. We've looked at recently all these scientific papers on psychedelic experience, and the problem is they don't really map onto any good phenomenology. So if you don't have a good phenomenology of the psychedelic experience, you cannot get the neural correlates for a start, because you don't know what you're trying to correlate. So the science is dependent on the phenomenology. That's one aspect of the importance of it. It's a condition for the science. But plus it just enriches the science of phenomenology itself. I mean, there are different forms of experience that are never spoken about in any of the books, as I've sort of explained through. The relation to panpsychism is a very interesting one, and obviously, as I did my PhD on panpsychism, it's one that's close to my heart. So where to begin? Well, okay, I'll just tell you what I'm beginning to work on now. There are these recent empirical studies on nature connectedness in relation to psychedelic intake by Sam Gandhi, David Luke, and others. And it seems that, certain psychedelics induce this notion that you're more connected with nature. And the main ostensible reason for this is mental health. But I think that is an interesting question. If this is the case, and you have to be skeptical with a lot of these scientific papers, but if it's the case that it does induce a nature connectedness, you can talk about the how this happens in terms of neural correlates and so on, I suppose. But why? This is an interesting question. Why is that? Why might this happen? You can then understand this in a more metaphysical system, that our differentiation from nature, or from objects, really is our practical way of thinking. Again, like Bergson speaks about, Whitehead speaks about. In reality, there are forms of connection of which we are consciously unaware. What Whitehead calls prehension. It's a new form of his form of perception, where the subject and the object interfuse, similar to what Bergson calls sympathy or intuition as well. And so this kind of metaphysics, this philosophy, can start making sense of these reports that one becomes one with the object. So instead of just seeing that as simply an illusion, which is based on another metaphysics of representationalism, which is there's a subject and out of that emerges the whole world. It's basically solipsism. It's a kind of scientific paradigm at the moment, really. There's this interfusion between subject and object, which is then where perception and causation become one. This is Whitehead's great discovery in a way. And along with that, there's the appreciation of the value of nature. So not simply like a connectedness based on feeling at one with something. It's also like feeling the intrinsic value of other things. And of course, this is connected to panpsychism in the sense that all things, all at least semi-autopoietic systems, it's another discussion, and it also self-systematic units, not aggregates, that have their own perspective, have, of course, their own telos, or subjective aim, as Whitehead says, or basically teleology. And that then is conditioned by a sentience therein, in other words, a panpsychism. So you can sort of use panpsychism to help frame these kind of psychedelic nature connectedness experiences. More than that, I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg, really. But more than that, interestingly, so I'm working with this great anthropologist of psychoactive plants, Luis Eduardo Luna, and who's a Colombian guy living in Brazil. But we discuss. He's an expert in indigenous Amerindian culture and their psychoactive use, and it's very interesting that just about all of although there's a huge number of these different Amerindian cultures in South America and Middle America, they're all basically animist, which is like the religious side of the panpsychist coin. And their animist cosmologies are completely conditioned by psychedelic use, usually ayahuasca, with DMT as the sort of main active ingredient. And when you actually look at the that cosmology, that metaphysics, very fascinating. There's this great book, The Falling Sky, by Davie Kopenawa, who's a shaman and of the Americas, and it's the only book really from the horse's mouth, as it were. But cosmology is very interesting. It sort of brings in these Platonic forms and so on, and it's a form of panpsychism, which is not simply, the tree in the river has a spirit. I mean, it's much more complex than that. And yeah, as I say, conditioned by psychedelic use. So what I really want to do next is look at the sort of similarities and differences between Western panpsychism, if you can generalize, and this Amerindian animism, if you can generalize, see how they differ, how they are similar, and how psychedelic experience conditions animism, at least, and how it might help then condition Western panpsychism. But this is in the pipeline, so I can't give you the answers yet.
The animism point is very interesting because last semester I wrote like this seminal paper where I was analyzing artificial intelligence from a Western perspective and Eastern perspective, and I discovered that Japan has this idea of an animist approach towards robots. So they think that robots have sentience, and they have ceremonial, like they bury them, they live with them, they think they're just like humans and like stuff like that. So definitely very interesting.
Yeah, and also, of course, another thing I need to look into is Shintoism from Japan, because it's an animate, there's the classic, traditional animist religion. I wonder if that feeds into the AI there. Interesting. I know hardly anything about it, so I'll stop there. But I mean, that's another thing to link in ultimately.
No, the Shinto Buddhist tradition. So there's this element of kami, which is, I guess, sentience in them. So there is somewhere between kami, robots, and animism, the entire AI picture fits in for Japan, at least. I mean, that's something that I was researching, and I was like, wow, that's interesting.
That sounds like an amazing PhD.
Yeah, but it was only a seminal paper, so I was like, okay, like I'm still waiting for the grades to come up. I was like, I think I did great.
You can send it to me, please.
Yeah. So this was a really potent philosophical conversation so far. And like, honestly, like I think I've had like 36 episodes or whatever, and like this one was definitely the most potent one. Like we dived into Platonism, then like everything was like literally amazing. So thank you for coming on. Like yeah,
thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I've been looking for like I've known you for like 2 years, like via the cybernet, like seeing your videos and then also your book, and like yeah, so it's it's actually a pleasure talking to you finally and having a thorough discussion.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I've seen some of your interviews before. They're really interesting, so good work. Keep it up.
Thank you. So take care.